The convergence of our voices is the song of our beauty. Many voices will speak here, the song woven through diverse notes.
All right. Hello and welcome to Cassandra Arnold. And instead of my just blabbing on about all your accomplishments, maybe you could describe yourself.
Yes, I forgot you were going to do it this way. So when people ask where I'm from, sometimes now I kind of go Commonwealth because I grew up in the countryside in the south of England, and then I ran away to Australia when I was 21 and stayed there by myself for a long time, got married, divorced, got a new partner who's gorgeous, and then we went to Canada for 13 years, primarily for his work. And then we came back late 23 to Australia for our retirement years. So there's that part of it. And then the main career I had was as a doctor working for Doctors Without Borders, which came from a childhood dream, and maybe we'll talk more about that later. Along the way, I did a whole range of other things. My first work in Australia was working in a frozen chicken factory, where they're slaughtering chickens, and that was less than desirable. And then I've worked in retail, I've worked in government offices, I've done, a huge range of things. And I accidentally got elected to the Newcastle City Council for the Greens along the way. And that's probably a reasonably good introduction. So on my sort of social media feeds, I kind of go artist, author, doctor, dreamer, which sort of sums it up, I think.
Yes, you've had quite a list of jobs there. Is there one that you think you like the best, or maybe more than one?
Oh, medicine, that's
Yeah.
hands down. That was just the most amazing thing. And um, if we, I don't know about, synchronicity and such like, but I was working at the time in a women's run collective, a domestic violence shelter in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney. And I'd been to a workshop in Sydney associated with that. And then the following weekend, I think I was walking down the street in the town and I saw one of the women who'd been at the workshop. And we were like, oh, hey, how cool is that? Because the workshop had been in Sydney, hours away.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, I'm going to a party tonight. Do you want to come? And my son was with his dad for the weekend. As divorced mothers, I got every second weekend off, which was which was rather cool. And I kind of went, oh, yeah, okay, I'm doing nothing. So I went to this party, and I noticed a group of people sitting around, and I'm actually quite shy in a lot of situations. So, I was just sort of hanging around on the outskirts. And there was this woman talking, a lot of people listening to her. So I went to listen, and she was talking about her experience of studying medicine at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And out of my mouth came the words, oh, I would have loved to have been a doctor. And she said, well, why don't you? They have a mature age entry, they have a quota for people who are not coming straight from school. And back in those days, and still some places in Australia, it's an undergraduate degree, not a graduate degree. So that was a thing. So I applied, and and it was complicated, but I got in. So that kind of just came out of nowhere, really.
Mhm.
Which I think things often do in life. And ultimately, I I did a lot of work as a doctor, and I worked a lot of locum work in the Northern Territory, working with Aboriginal people, and which was just amazing. And then I had to wait for sort of my son to grow up, and then along the way, I worked in the hospice for a year as a doctor looking after the dying patients in palliative care. And that really shook me because one of the patients was a woman younger than me. And like 9 months before, she'd been perfectly healthy. And then she just started getting stomachache. And by the time they discovered she had lymphoma or whatever, it was too late for her. So that really shook me into thinking, right, I absolutely have to go for my dreams, you know.
Yeah.
So I applied to Doctors Without Borders, and I got to the interview, and one of the first questions they asked me is, you know, and why us and not one of the other organizations? I was like, you mean there are others? Like, I had no idea there's others. I only know about you, you know. You were just the one that was in my mind, and that's the
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So I managed not to say that out loud. I was like, oh
Yeah.
well, you have the best values, and you know, I really. So that was quite fun. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And where did you go with Doctors Without Borders? What countries and what was the work?
It was very variable. So when you initially sign up, you have to say you're willing to go for 6 months, and would send you to what they call a regular project, which is a more longer running program that might be supporting a hospital or what have you. Um, so interestingly, the first day I met David, he responded to an advert I put in the local paper in their kind of looking for partners page. So I told him the first day I met him, I was like, look, mate, this is my dream. So you have to be willing to cope with me being away for 6 months, maybe at least once. And if you think that's not something you'd ever, you know, cope with, then don't start going out with me, because this is what I'm sort of aiming my life towards. And he was like, yep, okay, I'll deal with that. So I was expecting to go for longer, but what happened, there was a massive meningitis epidemic in the sub-Saharan Africa. So they were sending emergency teams all over the place, which worked out well because there's different branches of Doctors Without Borders that come out of different countries. So then Australia normally works with the French, but the Swiss branch was recruiting for this emergency. So I got sent with them, and I subsequently stayed working with them. So my first post was in a country called Niger, which is just south of Nigeria, which I'd never heard of. And we were looking after children with meningitis, and that was fairly extraordinary. And am I allowed to mention books and things that I have? Like,
Yes, absolutely.
absolutely. So this book is probably showing up backwards, Beyond Borders.
It shows up quite well, yes.
Okay. So that's like a photo journal essay of my experience of going on my first post. And it was heartbreaking. I mean, I was seeing people die. We were living in pretty rough conditions, but that was part of the adventure from my point of view. And I think through all my work, one of the things that makes you resilient is if you actually are willing to acknowledge that you're doing it as much for you as you are for the people you're helping. And I actually think that that's true for most of what people do most of the time. You know, we could be like, oh, I'm doing this super altruistic, but actually we're getting a payoff. You know, if I donate money to a cause, I feel good about myself. You know, if I help my neighbor move house, I feel good, you know. And for me, a lot of it was this longing for making a difference, this longing for doing something in the world. And also, it gave me an opportunity to see things and go to places and experience things that I wouldn't have experienced. And so there was the wonderful side of that, and then there was the really heartbreaking side of that. You know, watching people dying, and what was really frustrating was, I mean, the politics of humanitarian aid is a vast topic which I'm not qualified to go into in depth, but it did notice, you know, we were vaccinating these people with the sort of traditional vaccine against the meningitis, and that vaccine will only last about 3 years or so. But the vaccine we were given when we were sent to the field is a more modern, stronger vaccine that will give us immunity forever. And you just think, well, actually, we ought to have the money to be giving these people the top level vaccine. And that is something you really struggle with. So that only lasted about 6 weeks, that first episode, because as soon as the rains came, then people's noses are no longer dry and bleeding, and the bacteria that lives in your nose normally causes no harm, but crosses into the bloodstream when the nose is super dry in the dry season. Once it rains and your nose is nice and moist again, then the epidemic kind of stops by itself as well. And once people have natural immunity, if they've caught it mildly, and then they won't catch it again. So it's complicated. It's really complicated. So that was my first one, and then they offered me 6 months in Chad on the border of Sudan, Darfur. So then I was working 6 months supporting a hospital in a garrison town. So there were 8,000 soldiers garrisoned there, and there we lived under tight security. We were driven from our compound to the hospital every day and back again. I couldn't go to the hospital in the night when I was on call. I had to do it by radio, which is challenging because you can't see the patient. So, much harder.
Yeah. So that was a war zone at that
That
time.
was kind of a war zone, yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, and we had a safe room, and it was like a bunker with, layers and layers and layers of bricks and sandbags, and you went into it through, a sort of spiral. And I remember going into the middle of that and going, oh my God, if I have to be shut in here, I will just die of claustrophobia amongst, or just thinking, well, it's to protect us from mortar shells, right? It's not to protect us from direct attack.
Yeah.
And we had to do proof of life questions in Geneva, if you were kidnapped, what would you say that would prove you were alive? So questions that the answer to, and they wouldn't guess, to pick it up from your social media or whatever. So it was pretty freaky. And that was interesting, because one of the things that really makes this work special is you work with the local staff. Luckily for me, I'd started medicine when I was 34, single parent with a 6-year-old child. I was older. One of my good friends from before was a nurse. And so she said to me, now just listen to the nurses. Do not be an arrogant little ex of a doctor. Like pay attention to the nurses, and the nurses will look after you if you look after them.
Yeah.
And so I'd applied that in my work in Australia, and I applied it in my work with Doctors Without Borders, and that makes all the difference, I think. It's too easy. It's too easy to go with a kind of, and of course I had some of it, but the sort of white savior complex is a disaster.
Yes.
It's a disaster. And there I saw how difficult it was that we were sent on short-term rotations, because Doctors Without Borders is primarily an emergency humanitarian intervener. And it does exceptionally well at that, I have to say. When they run a project for a longer time, they'll still tend to send people for like 6 months or whatever. And that's really hard for the national staff you're working with. Because they keep effectively getting a new boss who knows nothing, who comes in and wants to kind of control things. And so there were moments when I was like, well, who set this up? This is crazy, Well, your predecessor, I was like, okay, you guys go away and design something that would be better, that you think will work, that better than I do. Go and come back with a plan, So, and I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed teaching people and, leading people, if you like, but leading them in a hopefully as best as I could, kind of bottom up. Yeah. So there was that place, and then, gosh, it'll all blur a bit because it's a few years since I stopped. But then I went back to the other side of Chad, and we were dealing with another malnutrition emergency, which is so hard. Like, I did a lot of work with kids dying of starvation, basically, and that is so painful. I mean, and people ask me, well, how did you cope? I was like, well, because I would just think, well, okay, some of them are dying, but if we weren't here, they'd all die.
Yeah.
So at least, it's like that kind of.
Yeah.
And the best thing about it was meeting all the people, and the mothers and the kids, and then I was in the Congo 3 times, and one of those was a measles epidemic, and we had we're building, beds for people as fast as you could. But if you wanted to build a new ward, we could order a canvas tent stuff. But if you wanted trees and things, people had to go out into the forest and cut the trees down and
Mhm.
cut them into sections and bring them back through the mud on motorbikes. And then they had to be constructed. And so, the patients were two to a little cot, and the parents are just sitting around. And then we had a ward where we put them when they were recovered, and they're waiting to go back to the villages. So we would take them back. But, on Monday, we'd go in this direction. Tuesday, we'd go the other
Mhm.
side. And so these mothers, I think it would be the only day in their lives that they would have had a day off,
Wow.
because
Yeah.
we were providing food. And now they had to wash their own clothes and things, but mostly they're just wearing, cotton wraps, and the kids are wearing,
Hmm.
nappies and a t-shirt when it's warm. So um, they were sitting around dancing and singing and braiding each other's hair and catching flying termites at night and roasting them. And they were just so ecstatic because their kid had survived, and they were just, and
Yeah.
they didn't have to spend that day doing work, which I just used to sometimes think, wow, that was such a special moment. And then they it's hard not to I'm worried about sounding, privileged and condescending, I suppose. But there was one moment where these women were saying to me, here, take this child, put it in your suitcase, take it home with you, it will have a better life.
Wow.
And and I, we'd been sort of laughing, joking, like, because I didn't often speak the language, of course. And so I like to go around without the interpreter. Like, we did a formal ward round, and I'd have an interpreter, and, the head,
Hmm.
the head nurse and so forth. But if I could, I would go round in the afternoons during the break, and that way I could just talk to the mothers individually, even if we use sign language. So we'd been using sign language. Does your child have vomiting, diarrhea? You can imagine. So there was a bit of hilarity, and then they were just like, take this child, take it home with you.
Wow.
And you just don't know what to say to that, really. I mean,
Hmm.
they're smart people, and they're just amazing. And the kind of resilience, I suppose, is the word. I mean, I've been very fortunate. I've grown up in countries that are not at war. I've always had enough food. I've had healthcare. I've had clothing. I've had a house. I've had, everything that I just think is normal.
Hmm.
And almost the majority of people in the world, that is not the case.
Hmm. Yeah. Ah.
So, and then I went to um, Haiti, not at the time of the big earthquake, but afterwards. There was a big cholera epidemic. So I was working in the cholera tents when they were just closing all that down. And Haiti's an amazing country. It's up and down and up and down and up and down. Um, and there's a lot of cultural differences. Like, in Haiti, I had teams that went out to the villages looking for cases, and looking on, giving public health talks and trying to teach people you need to still keep washing your hands, even if the cholera is gone, because that way your children won't die of all the other diarrheal diseases that they were getting, and cholera is going to be here forever. And they came back from one place and they said, we couldn't get to that village. There's a zombie on the road. And I was like, what? And they said, yes, a zombie, and it's dangerous and it's attacking people. And of course, from my kind of Western medical training, I'm thinking, that is probably, a paranoid schizophrenic or someone with a really serious mental health problem. But in their culture, that's most definitely a zombie. So I asked them about zombies, and they said, oh, no, no, they you can't necessarily tell by looking at them. They'll look just like normal, but their souls
Hmm.
being taken and replaced by this. And there's a wonderful story in the Beyond Borders book of being in Niger and getting teleported by a genie, was what the driver said, because we got lost in the sand, clearly trying to get back to base. There's no roads, there's no signposts, you just, and I
Hmm.
had a different driver who obviously didn't really know the way. And suddenly we're in a town with paved roads and gutters and heavens knows what. I was like, whoa. And we accidentally crossed the border into Nigeria. I had no
Oh,
passport, no papers, no nothing, right? So
yeah.
eventually we come to the border post, trying to get back to our country and the base. And he's explaining to the guard, the border guard, what had happened, and there's lots of gesticulating and whatever. And so afterwards I said, well, what? So then he waved us through. What did you tell him? He said, well, nobody could have traveled that distance in a vehicle. I was like, yeah, you were going really fast, and I kept trying to say slow down. Patients are jumping around in the back.
Yeah.
And he said, so obviously we were teleported. And I'm like, in my worldview, what teleports people, like UFOs? He said, no. An evil genie, wanted this woman's child to die in the womb, didn't want this child born alive, so it teleported us, you know, to
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a
that.
story.
So
So,
I think you think, that you're um working with a shared worldview, and actually a lot of the time you're not. Uh,
mhm,
but it was absolutely fantastic. And then the last post I went to was in Iraq, where I was so by this time I was the medical team leader, so I was responsible for two projects, and I wasn't doing hands-on medical work, but I was, helping first post expat doctors and the local staff. Obviously, we're all working together, and that was also very extraordinary. And I was in a place called I was in Kurdistan, so I still have it, like a resident of Kurdistan for a year permit. And I was in Hawija, which had been part of the war zone under Saddam Hussein. So the people I was working with had lived through war for like 10 years.
yeah.
And they were just, and we were struggling because in some ways they had learned really bad habits in the operating theater, for example. They didn't really want to stand around and wash their hands for 3 minutes. And, we were trying to reinstitute a lot of this stuff, and they were really cross. They just wanted us to keep giving them product, which
Yeah. Yeah.
I suspect was, getting sold some of the time. But it was the most extraordinary thing to be able to do.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
And so some of these are in your book, some of these stories.
Yes, the book only covers my first mission and then going back to the same place
Ah,
subsequently.
yeah.
Where the security situation had changed, and thinking about how hard it is to do this work because we were no longer allowed to stay there because of too many aid workers getting kidnapped. And
Mm,
obviously,
oh, yeah.
being kidnapped by the Nigerian militia is not something that you want
Hmm.
to have happen. So we had to leave. Yeah. So and then after Haiti, it would have been Ebola. And at that point, I was just like, oh, you know what? And David and my son were both like, please don't. And when I first joined up, my son was like, don't go to Afghanistan, you'll get killed. And I said, no, no, I promise I won't go to Afghanistan. And then I just thought Ebola, I thought, nah, I don't think I'm getting older. Now my hands and feet swell up in the heat and I don't cope as well. And I thought I wouldn't cope with the sort of spacesuit thing. Oh, it's time for the next generation. Um, and then because we were living in Canada, it would be very complicated for me to get licensed to work there. So I ended up retiring from medicine a lot earlier than
Yeah.
I would have. But I took up art, which I'd always wanted to do, and I've been writing poetry and um, only finished one novel, but I'm working on some more. So I kind of segued, into a
Yeah. Yeah.
different life stage.
Hmm. And these are from your own independent press?
Yes, I set up an independent press, Gilbert and Hall, which are two bushrangers in Australia. So the bushrangers, kind of the wild people fighting the government back in the day. Um, so some of my own work. So there's short stories, and there's the one novel, which is a kind of eco romance, and then some poems. And then over the last couple of years, I did anthologies. So this is a poetry anthology,
Mhm.
which has got 82 poets talking about all nature poems and so forth, and then a short story anthology with stories that are hopefully about
Yeah.
better future, or at least a future that we
Yeah.
can enjoy, and fairies and nice sort of
Yeah.
feel stories. So yes, and then I have collections of my own poems
Yeah.
that I've
So
read.
are you looking for submissions for one of your anthologies now?
Not at the moment.
No? Okay.
I sometimes get submissions coming. Usually I've done it through there's a thing called Duo Sumo, which costs a small amount each year, but it's a beautiful site and everything's curated for you, and it has a listings of all the kind of places that are looking for poems and stories, and so I've done it through that, and then advertised it, on Facebook groups and things, and
Yeah.
so forth. So now the next thing I want to do is finish one of my novels, I think. So I used to read poems every Sunday on Instagram for several years. So I've collected those into this book, which is really nice.
Oh.
And then
So perhaps you could read one of those poems now.
so I have a whole different kinds of poems. So there's kind of magical invocations and goddess poems and poems about places I'm visiting and the history there, and a lot of poems. I lived in Calgary in Alberta for 13 years, so a lot of poems about winter, naturally, and ice and so forth. So this one is called Lineage. Come now, rise early and walk the boundaries of your rooms with incense or candle or the blessing of your breath. Cleanse your space and your heart. Invite your guests. You are not alone. You are one in a lineage. They bow in greeting as they pass your threshold. Those who will come after, those who came before, your ancestors, your descendants. Dare you speak to them? Dare you listen to what they long to say? Because I think there's a lot about the world and what we're doing to it and how we're destroying things. And so there's, a whole section called Lamentation and a whole section called Embracing the Dark. And then there's a section, about hopefulness and so forth. And I think like this one is a lighter hearted kind of the song of the
Okay.
river. The river sings to herself as she falls and dives and rolls across the stones, all glistening, gleaming, graceful transparency, all burble and bubble and foam. The river sings to the world the very beingness of water, of rush and flow, of flood and ebb, of gathering power. I fling my arms wide on the bank, throw my head back, and joy bursts out of me. I sing to the river, and the river sings to me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Well, thank you for that lovely poetry. And thank you for talking to me. And so to everybody who's watching, like the video and subscribe for more interviews with some really interesting and amazing women. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so